Hello, everyone, and welcome today to the CBC online sponsored seminar, Yeast Nutrition, Ensuring Your Yeast Health, presented by Lallemand. My name is Joe Damgard with the sponsorship team here at the Brewers Association. Before we get started, just a few logistical things I'd like to go over. First of all attendees have been automatically placed on mute to eliminate any background noise during the event. But you can always ask any questions that you have by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many of those questions at the end of the presentation as we can during the scheduled seminar time. Also, if you see a question there that's already been asked and you'd like to hear the answer to, make sure to vote it up using the up arrow in the question box so that it floats to the top of the list. You can also make comments throughout the event in the chat feature on the right-hand side. Looks like everyone's figured that one out. But make sure if you have a question to use that Ask a Question feature, as only questions asked there will be addressed at the end of the event. If you have any connectivity issues during the seminar or you notice that your video is lagging, there's a few things you can try. First, try a quick refresh or click pause and play on your video player. Those usually fix the problem. If not, you can lower the resolution by hovering your mouse over the video player and clicking the gear icon at the bottom right. From there, you can lower the resolution to either 720 or 360p. If that doesn't work, you can try putting your video into compatibility mode. To do so, click the link at the bottom left underneath the live stream that says Get Audio Video Help. From there, you'll be prompted with some information about compatibility mode and how to activate it. Last but not least, we are recording the event, and the recording will be available at this very link a few minutes after we end the live broadcast. If you'd like to download the presentation slides, you can do so by clicking the green button at the bottom of your screen. That's about it for me. Now I'd like to hand it off to our speaker for today, Brian Perkey. Brian, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Joe. Good morning, everybody from the home office here in Pacific Northwest. Appreciate y'all coming in and joining me on this little presentation on yeast nutrition and steps to help ensure your yeast's health. My name is Brian Perkey. I'm the regional sales manager for Lallemand Brewing. And this presentation was designed specifically for the CBC online series here this year, in lieu of us getting together in Texas over a few beers this past week. So, and you see my email there. I'll share that information at the end of the presentation too, in case you need to get in touch with me with any questions or looking for additional information that might not be on this presentation. A sincere shout out and thank you to the Brewers Association for pulling this together and putting this on, albeit at relatively last minute. I know that they have taken a hard hit, as many of us in the craft community. And I wanted to share this initiative that popped up last week that the BA is doing in collaboration with Bottle Share, and this is Believe in Beer. And this is a national relief fund effort for folks in the brewing industry that might need a leg up at this point. So if you can and if you have the capacity, please join me in contributing to this effort. And if you're in need, please take the time to get on the BA website and seek out the information on getting some help via this fund. I know it's preaching to the choir, but it's a hard time for a lot of folks out there. And one of the things that I love about this community and why I've been in the brewing industry since 1992, it's because of the community. It's because of the love that's shared not only for the art, the science, and the history that is beer, but for the community in and of itself. So That's all I'm going to say on that. Moving on to who we are as a company. I just want to talk a little bit about Lallemand really quick. We're a privately held outfit, family owned, based up in Montreal. We specialize in the development, production, and sale of yeast and bacteria to a variety of industries. We've got 11 plus business units focusing on yeast and bacteria. Everything from specialty cultures, think meat and cheese, to obviously beer and wine, animal nutrition, silage, feedstocks, plant care, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're over 4,000 employees in 45 countries on 5 continents. And we've been involved in the brewing industry since the early 70s. Those little white sachets of yeast that you would get on that can of pre-hopped malt extract. And then as we have learned and grown with the industry over time, brought a whole range of unique products to the market. Our acquisition of Siebel Institute, AB Vickers, and most recently Scott Labs, has now positioned us to be able to serve all segments of the brewing industry, with both the products, services, and education. There's just a quick overview of some of the strains that we're able to offer at this point. Most recently, the Boss, just getting a lot of buzz right now. AB Vickers, been around for a couple hundred years. Started off with isinglass, which still offer as a process aid, but also nutrients and enzymes. Ergo, one of the reasons for this talk this morning. And then the Siebel Institute, which many of you are probably intimately familiar with. Been around since 1872. We just opened a new campus in Chicago, so expect a lot more offerings from Siebel and on the education front. And then our friends at Scott Labs, who are now acting as one of our fulfillment distributors, both in the United States and Canada. Okay. So why are we talking nutrition this morning? So I felt like it was probably one of the more misunderstood aspects of brewing science and processes. And the time is right now, especially with the burgeoning SKUs of, hard cider, and more notably seltzer, in addition to the recent efforts in hand sanitizer. Just how, as a brewer, I lived on shift beer and leftover slices of pizza from Bridgeport. Your yeast will take the food that you give it, but it may have a very different motive than you do. So they're not necessarily symbiotic and can be at odds in terms of what the yeast goal is and what the brewer's goal is. So so through the course of this this talk this morning, we're going to go over the nutritional requirements of yeast. We're going to talk about the necessary nutrients that are obtained from wort. We're going to talk a little bit about why oxygen is vital and what it does and does not do. A little bit about uptake and the utilization of nutrients. And then I want to touch on a topic called glucose repression. And again, it's where we bring either high adjunct or non-malt sugars to the yeast party. So really, we just touched upon the goal of the yeast cell is very different from your goal as a brewer. It could care one whit about your fancy recipe, your imperial sour, hazy, yada yada. Its strict function is to produce more yeast. And in that process, it's going to pump out a bunch of other byproducts along the way. So CO2 and alcohol, obviously we know of, glycerol, esters, aldehydes and ketones, additional sulfur compounds, typically off-putting, phenols, yeast autolytic compounds, organic and fatty acids, and higher fusel alcohols as well. And these individually and in tandem comprise about 400 or can impact about 400 of the over 900 total flavor and aroma compounds that can be found in beer. So it's a complex process that is susceptible to a lot of variables and can result in a myriad of byproducts in the end, both pleasant and unpleasant. This is the ASBC flavor wheel that shows some of those compounds. Now, some of the basic elemental requirements of yeast can be categorized into two different primary categories: macro elements and micro elements. All are important. The macro elements is what the yeast is going to use the most of, and in quantity, and that's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, magnesium, and these macro elements are all required in excess of 100 parts per million. And then on the flip side, the micro elements, equally as important, albeit in a smaller quantity, but that includes calcium, zinc, iron, manganese, copper, nickel, cobalt, and molybdenum, a rare trace element. And these are sub parts per million, or well below the macro element threshold. Now, and in addition to these two categories, there's also the some heavy metals, which can be toxic, even in trace amounts, and these can include aluminum, mercury, and lead. So some of the primary functions of these principal elements are highlighted on this screen here. And you can see the functions that are attributed to each. Macro elements, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, all impact those functions. Microelements are generally important as an enzyme cofactor, but influence and impact some primary functions, and we'll talk a little specifically about calcium and its role in flocculation, and then also zinc in the alcohol dehydrogenase pathways to ethanol production. So yeast nutrients and wort, it's our job as brewers to provide the following: the level and availability of these nutrients. It's of critical importance in the governance of the fermentation performance of brewing yeast. Carbohydrates supplied in the form of fermentable sugars, nitrogen sources primarily as amino acids, inorganic sources or those trace minerals, oxygen, air or tank O2. We're going to talk about oxygen a little bit later, and then yeast foods, other vitamins, fatty acids, sterols, minerals. So here, this slide is it's an example of the differences in the makeups of the wort that we're producing versus what the yeast is delivering to us. You look at, see what, let's say this is just a basic, 1040 wort. That 4% alcohol is taking a lot of energy in the form of carbohydrates to produce. Another thing that we'll talk about here is pH production, acid production, and how that's produced via an energy mechanism as well. And what you do in the brew house, your wort composition is going to influence these primary factors. The rate and degree of your attenuation or the overall fermentation performance, the amount of yeast produced. You don't want to produce too much yeast. That's excess biomass that ends up as a waste or loss. And conversely, you might find, or you will find, that you'll see a reduced biomass load in a higher gravity wort. Your wort composition also influences all of the major beer characteristics when it comes to, say, flavor, foam, aroma, appearance, and yeast flocculation is also a critical factor to consider. So the biggest nutrient or food that we're delivering to the yeast is carbon source in the form of sugar. This slide talks shows a little bit of the major nutrients required by fermentation. So brewer's yeast focuses on, let's see, where's my pointer here? Focuses on hexose sugars, disaccharides, and trisaccharides as primary sugars. And then on the slower side, you'll see poly and oligosaccharides in the form of starches and maltodextrins, and tetrasaccharides, which really are only utilized by specific strains of Cerevisiae. Now, even though some of these carbon sources or sugars may go relatively quickly, just of note that some yeast strains think like Brettanomyces, Diastaticus express strains, or even non-sac strains will employ these sugar sources differently than a standard Cerevisiae strain. This slide just shows the typical sugar composition of wort, and you can see that in addition to maltose, the other primary disac and monosaccharides only comprise about 60 to 70% of total fermentable sugars, and you see the bottom three there, tri, tetra, and oligosaccharides can be difficult, if not impossible, to metabolize, and these can contribute to the character, mouthfeel, body, etc. of your beers. Now, nitrogen is an important element in one of the macro elements, and primarily use amino acids, or yeast uses amino acids as a nitrogen from wort. Ammonium salts can be utilized as well. Think DAP, etc. Because without sufficient nitrogen, your yeast will not ferment or completely ferment. The metabolism of some of those amino acids are directly linked to some key beer flavor compounds, and can result in some off flavors and aromas if you're not careful and maintain at least a minimum of 150 milligrams per liter in your wort. Some inorganic sources of trace and bulk minerals. Your wort, by and large, should be sufficient in potassium, sulfur, phosphorus, and is possibly deficient in zinc, in addition to the magnesium to calcium ratio between the yeast cell and the wort medium. And again, we talked a little bit about toxic trace ions. These are toxic to yeast in minute amounts. We have some, the slide here will show some elemental roles of metal ions in brewing. Most of us are familiar with this concept. This touches on the adjustment or a mineral composition of water tables. So think Burtonization of, for IPAs, Pilsen for Pilsners. I mean, we go all around the world and pull water tables, and why beer styles have kind of evolved or developed around the water chemistry that was delivered by that specific locale. And it's a huge of huge importance on flavor. In addition to beer stability, here iron shows direct impact on foam and oxidation. You see the importance of the role of calcium in wort and in brewing. I mean, everything from wort pH to oxalate precipitation, a huge impact on yeast flocculation, the formation and utilization of alpha amylase. Calcium is a critical element in wort composition and in brewing and fermentation. So, in addition, copper can help offset or impact sulfury flavors, and then zinc with the with the help of stuck fermentations. So why do yeast need metals? I needed like an Iron Maiden slide in here somehow, but it's an obvious in. But we all need a little metal from time to time. But yeast, it's really using these elements for these 6 major factors. So from cell division, enzyme and activity influence fermentation, the ability for yeast to tolerate stress, key impact on growth and cell structure. And as we talked a little bit about calcium with the cell-to-cell interactions, most notably flocculation. So, and again, the key minerals that we're using in brewing is we're trying to solicit a controlled response from the yeast via fermentation into ethanol, which is the primary product that we're after. Well, yeast is really has a different set of rules that it wants to follow. because really all it's looking to do is propagate itself and make more yeast. One of the key minerals to manipulate in this equation is magnesium. It's one of the three primary, I consider primary elements. It might take a back seat from time to time, so that's where I want to start. Now, this magnesium is it's absolutely essential, and it's primarily responsible for impact or influence on enzymes responsible for glycolysis. It has a direct impact on the conversion of glucose to pyruvic acid, en route to fermentation and ethanol. It has a direct relationship with the viability and vitality of your yeasts, and it's very influential as a stress protectorant, both in ethanol, osmotic stresses, and thermal stresses as well. Now, just like we were talking about what you want as a brewer versus what the yeast wants as its own entity might clash, and magnesium and calcium don't necessarily get along. Magnesium is it's important for growth and overall metabolic health of the yeast, the yeast cell, but excess calcium in wort can actually inhibit the effectiveness of the yeast to utilize magnesium correctly. So you really have to be cognizant about the levels of these elements in your wort. Zinc, I think, is probably one of the most important elements in wort composition. This is an essential trace element for yeast physiology and performance. It's important for the activation of alcohol dehydrogenase, which is important for part of the metabolic pathway to ethanol production. Lower levels of zinc will result in stuck ferments. You really need a minimum level of 0.3 parts per million of zinc. Really, anything lower than that can cause fermentation and problems at the end of your curve. It's also critically important in contributing to as a stabilizer to the cell membrane. I'm not using this as a sales plug. This is one of the products that we focus on, is our Cervomyces, which is a zinc enriched yeast. We go through a lot of it. At a minimum, 6 milligrams per 100 grams of dry yeast mass is required for really a good yeast activity. It is toxic, but it's non-toxic up to 1 milligram per liter. It's an essential component of several enzymes and coenzymes. It's a stress and protective factor against killer yeast-specific proteinases. It stimulates carbohydrate, protein, and fat metabolisms. And it also helps accelerate maltose and maltotriose uptake to ensure a rapid or a predictable fermentation. Now, some important factors to consider is that these minerals should not be ignored. You can get away with making beer without paying too much attention to some of this, but it would behoove us all to dig a little deeper into the nutrient makeup of our wort, and primarily it's essential to optimize the magnesium, calcium, and zinc. If you focus on those three, it'll take you a long way. Zinc uptake is it's rapid and relatively complete. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. And for those of you that are have propagation programs, of factors to consider is that the mineral requirements for propagation may differ from what it is that you're doing with fermentation. So you should adjust your nutrient regime as such if you're conducting a prop. It doesn't take a lot for some of this to have an adverse impact. Specifically, think about magnesium and zinc and what it does to yeast stress resistance, in addition to your fermentation and flocculation performance. One process or procedure to consider is preconditioning of yeast slurry. This is a relatively new procedure, last 10 plus years or so, and it may help alleviate stress and boost your fermentation. So that's something to consider and explore as well if you have a prop program. It's kind of a cool slide. Looking at some zinc uptake factors. Please note that it moves relatively quick. So your wort content, or zinc content in the wort, is almost zero about after an hour. It's accumulated in your initial pitch or slurry, and then is redistributed to the daughter cells via division. And you see the slide here where this is a special stain that shows the zinc concentration within the cell wall. You see how it's super bright and then is diminished as the biomass grows, and that zinc is redistributed. So oxygen. Oxygen is used as a growth factor in reproduction, and not necessarily used as a respiratory factor. It's the biosynthesis of O2 helps synthesize key membrane components specifically ergosterol and oleic acids. It also helps utilize glycogen, or helps mobilize glycogen during the lag phase when yeast is starting to get up and going. You may hear that dried yeast doesn't require oxygen for its initial pitch, and that's because one of the things that we have to do in the manufacture of dried yeast is really jack that cell up with excess reserves of glycogen and sterols, so it comes out of the gate. So, but O2 is supremely important to membrane integrity, and is also a critical factor in ethanol tolerance. We'll talk a little bit about O2 shortly when we're looking at the cell wall. Really, its function is to provide a limber, flexible cell wall to facilitate transmigration and reproduction, budding. Some other vitamin sources which are typically sufficient in wort: folic acid, thiamine, riboflavin, pantothenic acid, niacin, inositol, and biotin. Sometimes biotin can be deficient, and but can be supplied as a yeast food supplement. And these roles are in these forms here. Anything from well, it's really a coenzyme factor when it comes to these trace elements. And again, it doesn't take much. So I want to talk just a little bit about pathways here. There's a few barriers that the cell will put up to us as brewers to get nutrients in, and then we kind of want to see how we get out of the yeast metabolites that we're actually after. So the primary barriers of the translocation of wort nutrients into brewing yeast are the cell wall, the periplasm, and the cell plasma membrane. In addition, there's some interior structure, the organelles that can provide some barriers, and then we have to consider. And then on top of these physical barriers, there's also physical chemical barriers that can impede the migration of wort nutrients. Chelation is where nutrients get together, bind together, and won't permeate the wall. There can be ad and absorption issues, and then the molecular size of components to get through there as well. So it's not always necessarily easy. Here is a diagram of the cellular plasma membrane. This is actually a picture of a human cell membrane, and the oxygen influenced ergosterol can be found here in lieu of cholesterol in this diagram. So this is one of the important factors that provide flexibility and permeability of the cell wall. Now, some of the transport mechanisms, right? How we get nutrients into the yeast is really broken down into these four mechanisms: free diffusion, facilitated diffusion channel, and active transport. The first three are passive transport mechanisms, meaning they require no energy to conduct a diffusion action. Active transport requires energy consumption, and primarily we use, or at use, is a mechanism called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, and its associated enzymatic action, ATPase. And really what this is, it's described as a proton pump that moves a charged hydrogen particle through the cell wall that will allow the uptake of a sugar or a mineral nutrient, most notably maltose and maltotriose. So, and take a quick gander here. This will come up in a little bit. Note that some of the sugars can be absorbed through a facilitated diffusion, whereas malt sugars require active transport. So a little description over some of the transport mechanisms through the cell wall. Free diffusion, which is a passive penetration, so think osmotic activity. It's relatively slow. Ethanol moves through the cell wall via free diffusion. Facilitated diffusion requires the help or an action of a permease enzymatic activity. Think of a gatekeeper there, letting something in or out. The diffusion channel is primarily voltage dependent. So this is a gateway, protein gateway that will be opened or closed via a charge, an electrical charge. These two facilitated diffusion channels are pretty quick, and then active transport, which is relatively slow. When I say relatively slow, and comparatively speaking, you guys been brewing with Voss, then you know how quick that is. So perspective. But again, that active transport is through that proton pump mechanism of ATP. And not only is that positive hydrogen charge responsible for the regulation of nutrient uptakes, which will factor your growth and fermentation, but it is how your beer will acidify, or it helps contribute to acidification of beer. 30% of the total pH produced is due to this activity from ATPase. The other 70% is due to organic acids, CO2 production, and the carbonic acid that is comes as a result of that. Now, some of the main or primary transport mechanisms for some of the elements, primary elements. Water moves through hydrostatic pressure and diffusion channels, passive think. Amino acids come through via active transport with specific permeases. Ions have a pathway through diffusion channels and again specific carriers, doormen that let them through. Ethanol, as mentioned, can transmigrate through free diffusion channels. Sterols, vitamins, fatty acids also kind of come through active transport, and sugars, as we talked about a little earlier, come through via various mechanisms. So glucose, fructose, sucrose through a diffusion channel, maltose, maltotriose et al. Through active transport. And why this is important, because glucose will always be the preferred sugar for a yeast strain prior to the assimilation of additional sugars, primarily malt sugars. And so why this is important is that you can see here, if you have a high glucose adjunct wort, that the yeast is going to focus on its metabolism before it starts taking you and your maltose, maltotriose sugars seriously. So it's going to move through glucose prior to any of the malt sugars. This could result in fermentation lags or extended fermentation times for your ferments. Oh, yeah, I just wanted to mention back on this slide that glucose, fructose, sucrose being taken up first are often referred to as starting sugars. So if you ever heard that term, you know what you're talking about. And so that is where this concept of a high glucose repression comes from. So making sure that that your starting sugars don't outstrip or outweigh the sugar composition of your worts for beer production. And why this is important now is because of the use of some of these sugars in seltzer, hard seltzer, ciders, and even some of the work that's gone into producing some washes for hand sanitizers. Glucose repression can impact the efficiency of your fermentation regimen. So in addition to that, the availability of your wort sugar spectrum, the metal ions that you have in the solution can impact a variety of metabolic pathways, low zinc, excess calcium, insufficient magnesium, toxic metals can cause fermentation problems. In addition to toxic metals as an inhibitory component, other considerations would be pesticides that would come in on a malt medium, can have an impact on yeast. Cleaning agents. Did you get everything out of that tank? That can have a detriment on yeast. One thing I want to talk about is a little about inhibitory components, about acids, which really not up here. Lactic and acetic acid in high enough concentrations can be toxic to yeast, as opposed to an inorganic acid like phosphoric acid, which can be or sometimes employed in an ancient technique called yeast washing. Ask an old timer about that. Insufficient O2 can result in slow growth by not providing enough ergosterol or oleic acid to the cell membrane for flexibility. Vitamin deficiency can result in some off aromas or flavors, specifically sulfur. Your low or your nitrogen levels are supremely important and can cause big problems. Think free amino nitrogen or free available nitrogen at the minimum 150 parts per million as a standard. And then the other physical chemical agents that can be have an impact on yeast and the stress of yeast. And I guess the acids could be considered as such. So some conclusions to all this. We need to strive to achieve a balance between yeast health and growth, and what it is that we're asking our little beastie friends to do, which is actually to ferment and produce wort. We do this by controlling their diet. Wort is food, and nutritive factors need careful consideration when designing a wort and its component makeups. So I'm hoping I didn't bore you to tears, and that through this presentation we've kind of gone through these 5 points, and you've got at least an introductory familiarization as to why nutrition is important in yeast and in brewing. Lallemand produces a couple of products specifically for this topic and these issues that we've covered. So reach out to your local rep for more information there. And then if you want to go down the rabbit hole on yeast nutrition, we have a specialized lecture at CBC. This is an online lecture that is conducted by Dr. Graham Walker, notable legend in the industry. This is a component part of a comprehensive World Brewing Academy offering under the Advanced Brewing Theory program. If you use that code right there, LALUSYN 25, you'll get 25% off the lecture. You can find info on this on the Siebel Institute.com website. Here is some basic contact info for our 3 divisions. The one I didn't get up here, which is the Scott Labs info, but that's at the beginning of the presentation. And as always, you can contact us and engage on social and alternative medias. We've been taking a lot of time doing Facebook Live lectures and starting to build our YouTube library so that you can all jump in and learn more at your leisure. All right. That is it for my presentation. Thank you, Joe.
All right, Brian. Thanks for all the great information there. It looks like we have about 22 questions so far here, so we'll get right to those and see how many we can get through in our time here. Otherwise, I could send anything that we don't get to you, Brian, to answer afterwards, and we can post those back. Kick it off. First question here. What are your thoughts about use of zinc and other techniques for keeping lager strains versus ale strains healthy in a healthy manner?
Both types of strains require zinc. Super easy. Doesn't matter if it's an ale or a lager. It's going to require that and other trace elements. You can go down the rabbit hole here by, lager is a slow grower. It produces less biomass than an ale yeast. So maybe the requirements might be slightly different, but they're both going to be important.
Okay, Frank had a follow-up to this one. Also, to add follow-up, you have mentioned zinc a lot. I've read that too much zinc is bad for yeast health. What is that line, and does it vary strain to strain, ale to lager, etc.?
Yeah, there is a toxicity level. Just like anything, too much of a good thing probably isn't.
Okay, next up, can you discuss adding yeast nutrients at more than one time, such as at halfway through the fermentation versus at the front end? At least one yeast nutrient comes with recommendation to add it at 2 times. This is for making hard seltzer, sugar brew bases. Can you recommend a product or a combo for making high percentage ABV sugar brew bases?
Yeah, so I'm going to recommend our stuff first, the Yeast Life Extra. It's a well-rounded or it's got everything you need in there. Do consider a fed batch nutrient addition. That's going to be dependent on the yeast strain that you employ. And if you want to read up on this type of process or procedure, look at the texts on mead making. Mead makers have to employ fed batch nutrient regimens quite a bit in order to finish the fermentation. And if you reach out to me at the end of this presentation, you'll have my contact info. We actually have some TDS information for you and best practices when it comes to doing hard seltzer. We'd be happy to help you out with that.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. Next up, we have a 2-part question. The first part, how long after cold crashing a beer in a fermenter to 32 degrees Fahrenheit is it okay to repitch that yeast to another fermenter?
Right away. You don't necessarily need a cold crash a tank in order to get a flocculent yeast out of the bottom. You just don't want it setting down there that long. Obviously, pull the dead stuff out of the bottom of the cone first. If you don't, and this is. It might sound dumb, but just a cheap and easy way to know that if that yeast is good, is just put a smear on your finger and wipe it across your tongue, and you'll feel the CO2 burn on your tongue. If you feel that, then you know you've got some nice healthy yeast that's ready to repitch.
All right. Second part of that question: at what level of yeast viability would you say is too low for repitching?
Yeah. I've gotten away with in the 70s, but it stressed me out. So it's, is it worth it? Is it worth, the impact of that tank of beer? If you think your yeast is compromised, grab another brick out of the cooler. Shameless plug. It's a great reason to have a brick of dried yeast sitting in the cooler just for that scenario right there. Back up.
All right. Next up, what measures do you recommend for longer storage of yeast during a lockdown amid COVID-19?
Underwater or wort, keep the pressure off of it. You can nutrient enrich prior to storage. That might give you a little extra time, but it's going to be strain specific. Some strains will hang out for, it seems like, forever without any detriment or any impact. Some doesn't seem like what you do, you can't get it through 30 to 45 days without it, taking a tank. If you are stuck, and this goes to anybody, if you're stuck after the end of a shutdown and you find yourself with some compromised yeast, just reach out to me or any of the other Lallemand reps, and we'll get you squared away. No problems, no questions, no charge.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah,
next up, do you have any input on yeast nutrients, boost, care, and hard seltzer? I just started working with it using EC 1118 now, and just ordered some ICV K1 V 1116 as well. And my first wort is fermenting slowly. I'm using a nutrient regimen and pitched an extra package of yeast.
Reach out to me after this lecture, and let's go over your nutrient regimen. And again, I'll get you what our best practices and a current TDS says on this. I've got a feeling it might be your OG that could be the issue. Remember, we just went over this this repressive action by glycolysis, or glycogen. So let's have a chat about that. Okay.
Awesome. Next up, you referenced the ratio of calcium to magnesium. How does the ratio influence the fermentation opposed to the individual levels of magnesium, calcium?
Well, really, it's gonna reduce. I guess if that ratio is out of whack, it's going to reduce your overall fermentation efficiency. So they're going to drag. They might not finish. You might get some off aromas or off flavors, but really the big thing is flocculation. So calcium is key in the ability for yeast to adequately flock out. So really, by overdoing it, which is easy to do, and a lot of people do it, can cause a myriad of problems downstream. I think there you go. I think that's it.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Next up, two-part question. What's the best way to add zinc to the brew water?
Active dried yeast, zinc enriched, called Cervomyces.
All right.
Give us a call.
What if RO water is used?
Same data. If you're doing RO water, then you should be putting plenty back in addition to zinc, to approximate the water table of the beers, historically of the beers that you're trying to produce. So think about IPAs, water that's been Burtonized, Czech Pilsner's water that's been calcium enriched to Pilsner. And somewhere out there is an awesome table of all the key brewing capitals around the world and their associated water tables. And that's the great thing about RO water, is that it strips everything clean so that you can really use, you've got a base template to work with, as opposed to someplace like where we live here, Parkdale, Oregon, where we have great soft water and makes fantastic lagers. But it's a pain in the ass to really, strip everything out here to try to rebuild it, just due to the size of the brewery and the cost of that system. So.
All right. Kate has a question. Says, we're having a hard time repropagating yeast from our New England IPA. Any suggestions?
Yes. Yeast propagation can require a different nutrient regimen versus a fermentation procedure. So give us a holler. We'll talk about what it is that you're trying to do in your prop. So what New England strain? Some of these aren't very flocculent. So if you're trying to drop yeast, you'll get maybe the types of cells at the bottom of the tank that you're pulling from that doesn't necessarily translate to the best slurry that you could have pulled from that prop. You do that successively a couple of times. Next thing you know, you're way off the mark. But give us a holler. We'll work with you on your prop program.
Excellent. Thanks. We have a question here from Dave. Is it harmful to add oxygen if using dried yeast, and is there any benefit or harm at reasonable levels?
No, not harmful. No harm, no foul. You don't necessarily need it on the first pitch, on the dry pitch. Again, part of the manufacturing process of producing dried yeast is that we have to really boost those levels of sterols and glycogen reserves, so it comes out of the gate rocking. But if you have an SOP that you and your brewers are following, don't change it just for the first brew. It's fine.
Okay, we got one from Greg here regarding repitching yeast. Repitching yeast from one fermentation to the next. I'm concerned about genetic drift. What is a typical number of generations before yeast deterioration? We do not have a sophisticated lab setup and don't want to waste labor and materials on making bad beer.
Yeah, good point. It depends by strain. It depends on what you do up front to that yeast. So if you're repitching yeast, then the healthier that you can keep it for longer, the better off you're going to be. So that's why the use of a nutrient up front, either in rehydration, propagation, the initial first ferments, is going to be of critical importance of maintaining the viability and vitality of that slurry over time. Some strains you can get up into the high teens, low 20s. One of the breweries I worked at, where didn't have a great lab, just a scope and a hemocytometer. We're doing basic viability and counts. It seemed to be that, and again, it's strain specific, but it seemed to be like once you see that batch, like if you're doing an IPA or a pale or whatever, and dude, you guys have that thing down like clockwork, and you're on your 14th generation, everything is fine. Okay, maybe the 15th generation, that took you an extra 10 hours, 12 hours to finish. That's your sign. It's not going to get any better. Don't try to push it a second pitch. That first indication of a slower point to terminal is your canary in the coal mine. So that's the last beer that you brew with that batch of yeast.
Thanks, Brian. Next up from Jared, any issues with adding an out-of-date yeast pitch that was harvested and not used to the boil as a nutrient? Is there a ratio of wort gravity to slurry that should be added, and or a volume of yeast to barrels?
There's nothing wrong with that. Yeast slurry or dead yeast it's a great source of amino acids and vitamins, in addition to trace minerals. Somewhere, yes, there is. I've got that formula. I can't think of it off the top of my head. Reach out to me and I'll dig that up out of it's. I've got it in a note in a book around here somewhere. But there is a ratio of slurry to wort based on Plato or density.
All right, question from Bill here. What are the starting recommendations of the parts per million for magnesium, calcium, and zinc?
They're on one of these slides. I'll send that to you. These are all sub micro or less than parts per million. Each are specific, and I can get you those levels and dosage recommendations, at least based on our products.
Okay, thanks, Brian. We got one from Brett here. What's the best way to increase FAN?
So free amino nitrogen, free available nitrogen, diammonium phosphate is probably the best or the easiest, most readily accessible as an ammonium salt. You find it, reach out to your brewing ingredients supply outfit and give me a holler. If you don't have manufacturers' recommendations on that, we can get that for you.
All right, next up, H2S production on fresh pitches seems to be occurring haphazardly with our dry ale yeast. Wort aeration is at a 10 parts per million, and we use yeast at 82 by 85 grams per 20 barrels. Fermentation is at 70 degrees. This seems to be occurring most in low ABV beers. Would too much yeast nutrient play a role in the H2S production? Also, would DAP at high quantities cause this issue?
So yeah, so that elevated level of FAN, again, too much of anything can be a bad thing. So I would watch that. But really, I guess my first question there would be, what strain are you using? And we'd have to look at its properties to see if it's a notorious sulfur producer. Sulfur can be well, there can be a copper issue. Can be alleviated by the use of the physical use of a copper in the brew house, or it could be a vitamin or a other nutrient problem. But first, I would look at the strain.
All right. Next up, how much zinc adds Saccharomyces in the usage rate? 1 gram Saccharomyces, HL wort, and how much of it is going into trub?
So none of the zinc is being sucked up by the trub. It's easily hydrostatic, or it dissolves into solution. So, but it will disappear at the get-go during the first during lag phase of fermentation. So, and zinc concentrations are based on your batch size and beer density. So again, give us a holler, and we can talk about your recipe and determine what the correct concentration of zinc via servo or any other medium it actually is.
Okay, next up from Dana. Have you looked at using canola oil-based anti-foam as a yeast nutrient to provide linoleic acid for the yeast?
No, but I love the fact that you brought that up. It's one of the things I didn't talk about in my slides. I've never used canola, but I do use olive oil for my hard ciders. because I don't have the ability to I feel adequately aerate when I'm doing it's just the way my setup is. There was a study, and I don't think I'm out of turn by sharing this. It's out in the public interwebs. There was a study that was done by New Belgium Brewing 10, 15, God, I'm not that old, am I? 15, 20 years ago, where they did a side-by-side of the fat tire using a traditional aeration methods and the use of olive oil in minute quantities as a provider of oleic acid, and the results are really fascinating. I'm going to shut up right there and encourage you to seek out that study. If you need a copy of the link, give me a holler, and I'm happy to share that with you. Interesting concept, and can potentially save your ass sometime.
All right. Thanks, Brian. Looks like we got time for maybe one or two more questions. This next one up from Tom. Any specific nutrient recommendations for ciders that would be different from beer recommendations?
A full spectrum nutrient. So just straight cervomyces or zinc isn't gonna carry you through. Those products, ciders, seltzers, mead, they are nutrient deficient and require a lot of help for optimal yeast health and to ensure a healthy fermentation and a quality product out of the back end.
All right, we'll do one more question here. Then, Brian, I'll send you anything that we didn't get to. You can address those afterwards, and we'll post those back online. This next question from Nicole: does low zinc contribute to acetaldehyde off flavor?
I don't know if acetaldehyde in specific. I do know that that part of the pathways to ethanol production are impacted by minerals. So zinc, just like all of the other required nutritional elements, contribute to the reduction or elimination of those types of off flavors.
All right. Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you for the great presentation today, and a lot of great information there. I just want to remind everyone that this presentation will be available at the same link for replays a couple minutes after we wrap up here. You can also download the presentation slides at that green button at the bottom of your screen. Brian, anything else to add here before we shut this down?
No, just really appreciate everybody taking the time, listen to me blather on for a little bit. We still brew with you, even though we're all stuck at home. Keep an eye out for us on the interwebs. There'll be more of these types of lectures and virtual seminars coming up. So, Joe, thank you and your team at the BA. I know it's a rough time for you all, but I know I'm not the only one saying that you guys have done a great job in pulling this off, and we look forward to seeing what you guys have got for us in the future.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate that, and appreciate everybody joining us today. That's it.
Awesome. Cheers, y'all.